that's on the other computer.
Yeah, I know.
Did we get the green light, green line? Looks like so, huh? I can't see that from here.
I wonder, are you able to see
Oh, yes.
the whole thing when you go online?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I've never checked that out. I think you can.
You look pretty happy yourself.
Yes, I am.
Well, I don't want it to happen again.
See what side you're on now.
I think we can start.
Okay, one moment, please. Is your recorder started?
What's that?
Is your pocket recorder started?
Oh, yeah, good idea. All right. This evening, we're going to discuss the second house of the Sigmund Freud horoscope. And it'll be a little slow again because I'm trying to reintroduce all of this material. Whoa! There'll be a little break here while I get the handouts. Nothing for the viewing audience walking off camera. How did that happen, I wonder?
I have no idea.
All right. These are the evaluation sheets that we use for each of the houses. This is the second house evaluation. And in working with them, I found out that there was an error in the first house evaluation aid, so this is a new one of the first house. There will be another handout, but that'll be at the end when we're all finished with this part. Now, since we have people watching over the internet, they're going to want to know what we're doing. And as soon as Jerry gets the camera, we'll look at here. All of the handouts of everything that we have done in this course are, if you go to fellowshipofthespirit.org, and then you scroll down to where it says Spiritual Astrology, and you click on that. And then you scroll down in Spiritual Astrology until you see the textbook for astrology, psychology, and mysticism. When you click on that, that will give you a PDF copy of what is called the textbook, and it has everything in it that we have done so far. So that if you want to catch up on past things by watching past videos and having the paperwork to go with them, you can do that. I will update it. I think I'll be able to keep it updated as we go along. It's not too difficult of a process. All right, the first thing we looked at is, it says on the top, going down the left side, house size. And it says it's approximately 36 degrees. Now, the average size of a house must be 30 degrees, or 1/12 of a circle. So when we have a house that is 36 degrees, it's a little larger than average, but it's not greatly so. Now, this kind of thing has different meanings. And the most common meaning is, which generally holds true, that the larger the house, the more its importance is increased. Now, we've said all along that houses represent fields of opportunity, mundane opportunities, where the signs, which are sometimes called celestial houses, represent fields of attitude. Now, the way this works is that the sun, the moon, and the planets, if they stay in a house longer, they're more likely to be affecting things, because the luminaries and the planets are the activators, and they are what focus the astrological influences. Now, if each degree, like take for the sun goes through approximately a degree a day on the zodiac. And each day is an opportunity. So you can say that each degree represents an opportunity relating to the affairs of that house, at least to those affairs. And it's an opportunity to form an aspect with one of the other natal planets. Now, size obviously is not the only way we determine the relative importance of a house. But to begin with, it's one way, it's one component, it's one factor in determining house importance. As we pass through the talk tonight and future houses, we'll find more ways. Now, we'll verify the relative importance of the second house in a few minutes. Now, the next thing is we try to get the background, the spiritual or the attitude background in as a flavor of the house. And we see there house degrees per sign. And it says that the last 21 degrees of Sagittarius are in the house and the first 15 degrees of Capricorn. And they are the background flavor. They are the, you might say, the painting on the wall for this house. Now, Sagittarius and Capricorn are winter signs, because when the sun is in them, it's in the heart of winter. Now, this means that for Freud, when the sun and the inner planets pass through the second house, it's going to be wintertime. That means he'll have direct opportunities for income and expenditures in wintertime. Now, because the inner planets and the luminaries move so fast, they do most of all of the triggering. The planets trigger off progressions or transits or things like that, and most that are in the natal horoscope. And most of that is done by the sun and the inner planets because they're moving so fast. So this means that for Freud, winter is going to be a lively season for activating the second house. Now, Sagittarius and Capricorn are ruled by Jupiter and Saturn, respectively. And Jupiter and Saturn are called judicial planets. The interaction between them is called the line of justice. And in judicial matters, you adjudicate, and that means you ponder what's going on. So Saturn and Jupiter are both pondersome planets. Jupiter represents the spirit of the law. It represents the bigger sense of the law. It sees the law as benefiting humanity, and the Jupiterian influence in law is more likely to be generous and forgiving. Saturn, using the traditional language that we have, represents the letter of the law. And it benefits humanity not by the spirit of the law, but by control. And for this reason, Saturn is likely to be very exacting about the law. So, with these two planets and these two signs being the background and the foci of the second house, it's safe to say that Freud would be judicious about finances, which he indeed was. Now, if he's judicious, it doesn't necessarily mean budgeting or anything like that. It would be Mercury that would be likely to keep an exact budget of what was spent and what the income is going to be. So he did ponder income, and he did ponder expenditures, but he did so according to his values. Now, in this, according to our rough estimation system, Jupiter is the strongest planet in this horoscope, and Saturn is the second strongest planet in this aspect. And that is another indication that the second house is of high importance. But it's still too early to say, because we're only looking at the second one. We have 10 more to go. It's still to say that it's too early to say that it's going to be of major importance overall. Now, Saturn and Jupiter form an aspect. They form a square. And that aspect is above average strength in our estimation system. But again, it's not one of the top aspects. Nonetheless, because both planets have direct and indirect influence in the second house, this is an important aspect in second house affairs. So we're going to sometime look at Saturn square Jupiter, and probably not tonight because we have much more to do. The next thing we look at in the is in the third line. It says, is there an interception? An interception is when an entire a sign is in a house, but it is not on either the front cusp or the second cusp. So we can skip that. We'll wait until we encounter that. Is the second house a house that has the same sign on both cusps, the first and the last cusp? No, so we can skip that. And this brings us down to the fact that there are, so we don't have, that is not the case. Now there are no planets in the second house. We're looking now at direct house influences, which is the third line down. And by direct house influences, it is meant that there is a house a planet right in the house. If we look, for example, at the seventh house of Sigmund Freud, we see that there are 3 planets in the house, and they are giving direct influence. But in the second house, there are none. This is fairly common. I have seen as many as 4 different signs in a house. If you get into Northern Europe, like if you get into places like Latvia and Estonia, you can look at horoscopes there, you'll find double interceptions. There'll be the end of one sign on the front cusp, and then there'll be a sign that's intercepted, and then there'll be another sign that's intercepted, and then the first few degrees of another sign at the very end. There have been a few people that have had double interceptions that are famous. I think Richard Wagner might be one of them, but I don't trust my memory to say that. Now, the only direct influences in the house are the signs. But the signs can't do it by themselves alone. They need a planet to do the focusing. So this means that all of the house influences are indirect influences and none are direct as far as planets are concerned. All right. So far we've seen there's a fairly strong significance to the second house. And that's an important thing to do because especially young astrologers who haven't done much, a lot of astrologers and especially young astrologers ignore empty houses and they think that they're unimportant. Well, that's certainly not the case at all. As we just noted in Freud's second house, there are no planets. Houses with no direct influence, like empty houses they're called, are very common. If you think about it, there are 10 basic planets, including the sun and the moon, without getting into la-la land with all sorts of minor planets and other things. There are 10 planets and there are 12 houses. That means 2 houses have to be empty at least. And in this case, we see the 9th house, the 10th house, the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd. We see 5, or even the 12th house because the dragon's tail. So we see 5 or 6 houses that are completely empty, which means that there's a gang of planets in other houses. Now, you could probably, if you took a lot of time and sat down with a calculator or with a computer, you could probably figure out the possibilities of empty houses and things like that, but I've never sat down and done that. That's that grand program that I want to do someday. And maybe I'll get there when I have no more energy to be active. So, though there may be houses with no direct influence, every house must have indirect influence. We're now down at the section that says indirect house influences. Indirect influence is based on the principle of astrological rulership. All of the planets go through the signs of the zodiac, and each planet gets along or doesn't get along with each of the signs. For example, if you put Mars in an Earth sign, it doesn't do so well because Mars is energetic and it doesn't like to be inhibited. It gets very well controlled by Saturn in Capricorn. It's said to be exalted there because it is controlled and energy is not wasted. But Mars likes fire signs because in fire signs it can revel in all the energy and the pouring out of passion and things like that. And sometimes it likes fire signs too much. In my experience, Mars in a fire sign often indicates pugnaciousness. People who are looking for and picking fights. In this, as the planets go through the signs, there is at least one sign in which the planet agrees especially well. The planet is most at home in that sign or those 2 signs. It is so attuned to that sign that it is the living representative of that sign. Some mystical astrologers believe that the planets are precipitations out of the signs, and the signs out of which a planet is precipitated are considered the signs of rulership. Now, normally we say that Venus rules Taurus or we say that Mars rules Aries, but it's just as valid to say that the sign rules the planet, because excuse me, the interaction of rulership is such that it is a two-way rulership. What happens to the planet affects the sign, and what happens to the sign affects the planets. If you're not familiar with this is, fourth course on down the line. If you go to the introductory course on the website called Topics in Astrology, there is a list of planetary rulerships. In this, in the mandala, the outermost color is the color of the sign, and it is the color of the ruler of the sign. We have the legend for this for the mandala board over here, and you can see that the color of Mars is red, the color of Aries is red, and so we can see that the rulership of Mars falls in Aries. Now, the way that rulership works is that whatever happens in a sign affects its ruler, and whatever happens to that ruling planet affects the sign. This is an exclusive relationship. It is like no other relationship between a sign and a planet. Whatever happens to the planet affects the sign it rules. Whatever happens to a sign affects the planet that it rules. Now, it is a debatable subject, but because there is a special relationship, nothing is as strong as the rulership relationship. Now, in astrology, there are other placements that have effects and that are strengthened, and they are called stations. And the stations are rulership, exaltation, detriment, and fall. Rulership has this special relationship. Detriment has the quality of being the weakest place of a planet. Exaltation is where a special quality comes out of the planet that is exceedingly strong and that it is ideal for the thing, but it doesn't cover the whole planet. It's a special thing. Like the sun rules Leo, and it's most like Leo, but the sun is exalted in Aries, and the sun is the source of vitality. And the thing that is exalted when the sun is in Aries is vitality. This is springtime. Energy is bursting out all over the place. Now, if you want to get used to using the mandala board, these are the this circle here. The outermost is the ruler. The second one in is the exaltation. Sun is exalted in Aries. The third one in is the fall. That's Saturn. If you look on the legend board, you can see that. And the innermost is the detriment. It's the weakest. So you're going from the strongest down to the weakest, and the exaltations are in the middle. All right. Now, the stations are emphatic, but even though they are emphatic, they do not have the two-way effect of rulership. Now, rulership is the basis of house determination. And the principle of rulership between a sign and a planet goes back to the very beginning of astrology, and as far back as the historians have gone, the principle of rulership has been there. Now, if we're applying this to the indirect influence of the second house in the Sigmund Freud chart, we see Sagittarius on the cusp of the second house. So we say, since Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, we say Jupiter rules the second house. Now, the control of the first cusp of a house is the primary determiner of the opportunities of that house. Even if that sign at the beginning is very small, the sign that controls the beginning or the first cusp of a house is said to be the ruler. And there's a way that you can look at that. If you look at the houses, you can say they're like the rooms in a dwelling place, a house like we have as our home. In such a case, the first house, here we have the first house and sign lined up, the first house is like the front door and the entryway. But in the astrological domicile, it is different. The second house is where you keep the goods. It's the safe or thing where things are locked up or something like that. So that is not normally right in the hall, inside of the front hall. And for example, the fifth house is like the recreation room. Or if you look at the 10th house is, if this is a mansion, it's the grand ballroom, or it's the place where you do formal social entertaining or something like that. So each of the houses is like the room in a domicile. So if we follow this analogy out, the first cusp going around in zodiacal direction, the first cusp is like the door of the house. And any planet that is in the house is like a piece of furniture, or it's like some kind of appurtenance, like a furniture, like a refrigerator, or something like that. So, before you can get at the refrigerator to have something to eat, you've got to be able to get into the room. And in order to get into the room, you have to go through the door. And going through the door means you have to have the key to open it. This is a secure house. So you have to have the key to open the door. And the key to open the door is the planet that rules the sign on the cusp. This is like the new iPhones. They only open up for their owner. All right. The sign that we just looked at with Freud's second house, we said that the background was Sagittarius and Capricorn. That's sort of like the ambiance. It is, that's sort of like the paint or the wallpaper or something like that. That's in the background. All right. Now, if we go back, you're going to be at a little bit of a loss. You're probably going to want to go to that site and,
I'll catch up.
Yeah. If we look at our estimations, we see that Jupiter, the ruler of Sagittarius, and therefore the ruler of the second house, it's in a Jupiterian sign. It's in Sagittarius, the other rulership for Jupiter. So Jupiter, as the strongest planet in the horoscope, is magnified in its Jupiterian nature. Jupiter itself, in the Freud horoscope, is in the fifth house, and that's the house of children, expression, education, entertainment, speculation, and a number of other things. There is another book on this website called Astrological Tools and Techniques, and it has keywords for each of the houses and each of the signs and each of the planets, and even the aspects, so that you can familiarize yourself quite quickly. All right. We would expect all of these things children, expression, and all of that to affect second house matters, because that's the house that Jupiter is in. And some of that we'll do in the next few minutes, and some of that will come out in the brief that we hand out at the end of the talk. But still, most of the things are unfinished, which means you're going to have to do the work. In these talks, we give examples, and we try to give thorough examples and give the method of how you come to understanding things, but we can't go through all of them. We'd be here forever and ever. Now, Jupiter is the only ruler of the second house. And since there is no indirect influence, the estimated strength of Jupiter is the estimated strength of the direct and indirect house influences. And we see that right after the indirect house influences. We see the number 183. So we can see that that is the strength. Now, with Capricorn and Saturn also influencing the house, you could say that Saturn also has some indirect influence. However, I don't know how to quantify that. That's just way too subtle, and there are way too many factors to do that. So what I do when I encounter something like that is I just keep that information in the back of my mind, and then when it is necessary to use it, or when it's helpful to use it, it comes into play. Now, you're probably aware that we are again going very slowly and very tediously. I'm trying to introduce the method more clearly than we did with the first house. It's not always going to be like this. It's for tonight, and after that we'll go through these things much more swiftly and spend much more time on the interpretation than we do on describing the process of how we get to the interpretation. Now we proceed down to the last two sections, the direct house activity and the indirect house activity. And any time that we hear the word activity, activity means aspects. And the aspects, we've said it many, many times in all of the courses, that the aspects are the most significant part of any applied astrology. Now, it's obvious that since there are no planets in the second house, there is no direct activity. So we can just pass on and move down to the last section, which is direct house activity. Now, Jupiter forms three aspects, and they are listed here right on the evaluation sheet that we passed out earlier. There is Jupiter sextile Mercury, there is Jupiter square Saturn, and there is Jupiter opposite Mars. And those are the indirect activity that are going to have some influence on what takes place in the second house. So, the total of those three comes out to be 168. And that is the total indirect activity, and because there is no direct activity, that's the total house activity altogether. All right, we've gotten through a lot of the explanation, and now we're ready to launch into the little bit of second house discussion that we're going to do. And the discussion is two-track. That is, part of it is oral, it's in the talk, and the other part is in the handouts. They're called briefs. And in general, usually the more theoretical material will be offered in the oral part in class, and the more hardcore astrological material will be in the handout, or it'll be on the website. Now we throw a curve at you right away. The second house presents us with the opportunity to study sign and house overlap. This is something that's usually done only in an advanced level. It was mentioned earlier in this class, but there is sometimes a blurring between the signs and the houses, or there is an overlap. Normally, houses represent fields of opportunity, and signs represent fields of attitude. However, when a house is exceedingly strong, it will influence or it will affect the corresponding sign to that house. So like the second house is abstractly ruled by Taurus. But in our case with Freud, we have Sagittarius here. And if Jupiter were exceedingly strong, that Sagittarian nature would influence Taurus no matter where it was in the horoscope. Now we have said the second house is strong, but it's not that exceedingly strong that is suddenly going to change the nature of Taurus. But if we do it the other way around, if the influence of a sign is exceedingly strong, it will influence the corresponding house. In this case, we see that there are 4 planets in Taurus. And even though none of them is exceedingly strong amassed together, that indicates there's a lot of Taurus influence. And that means some of the Taurus influence is going to affect the second house. And how you bring that into your consciousness is not an easy thing to do. It's something that you hold in your mind, and things will jump out at you, or things will, the environment will become clear to you. In this case, we have these 4 out of the 10 planets in the second house. And those planets are Sun, Uranus, Mercury, and Pluto. Now, all of them are average or below average in strength, but together they're enough. Now, the main question is, how great is this influence, or how does it work? And boy, that's hard to answer. We have a word that says consider. Consider is an astrological term. Sider means star. Consider means to bring the stars together, like consolidate is to bring stuff together. So considering is a process of bringing together all the astrological factors and drawing out what they mean. Now that's not easy to do. You can have intuitive hits about the signification of something, of what it's going to mean, but to have a big picture of all of the factors blended together is not easy. It requires a lot of observation, and it requires a well-tuned intuition and plenty of pondering. And those are things I can't teach you. I have a hard time trying to teach myself those things. Now, we can do a little bit of that with the time and space that we have allotted in this class. All right, now let's dig into the second house. The second house, well, let's take some of the really simple things. Rules income and possession and saving and spending. Now, Freud's attitude toward the second house was such that it required more than average income. He had a big family. He liked to do a lot of traveling and do things like that, and that costs money. And so he worked probably right until just about the last 2 or 3 days of his life, because He needed, income. Now, he didn't need it because he lived luxuriously. His lifestyle was comfortable, but it wasn't luxurious, and it wasn't frugal either. Now, Sagittarius often indicates a happy-go-lucky attitude. And if Jupiter is strong and ruling the second house, even especially if Jupiter is in the second house, that can indicate a spendthrift. Easy come, easy go. Let's spend it all right away. The universe is filled with money. More will come in. Now, in this case, Jupiter is strong, and it is fluent, but it isn't spendthrifty. So we can see in this character, because of the Jupiterian attitude, the style that he lived and the way that he spent his money, the Jupiterian influence was stronger than the Tarian influence. The Tarian influence would hang on to things, and it would be acquisitive, and it just collects everything. Now, Jupiter is a sign of abstraction, and his attitude about money was that he saw money as a medium of exchange. Now, in terms of the study of economy, he lived as if a fluent, spending freely was a healthy economy. This is Keynesian economics. If you put all the gold in the ground, or if you put your money in the mattress or something like that, you cause an economy that is constipated. And that's not very healthy. So he felt that you spend the money as you take it in. He never owned a house. He always rented. He never owned a carriage or any other large possession. And other than necessary personal possessions for himself and his family, he had few personal possessions. He didn't collect a lot of books the way Jung did. He read a lot, but not to the extent a library like Jung had. There is one exception to this, and the exception is very Tarian. He had the Taurus proclivity for collection, but not a whole bunch of collections. And this is one way that there is an overlapping or a blurring. And the way that it worked out is totally fascinating. It's going to involve a little bit of a side trip. Everybody needs to have something of value. Especially intelligent people have to have something that they base their rationale on. For some people, it's religion. For Freud, one of these things was science. He considered himself a scientist. He considered his psychology scientific. In his case, the science is ruled by the sextile of Jupiter to Mercury. We'll come to that in just a little bit. But science was not enough. By itself, it was not enough. He needed something more. And for him, the thing that was something more for him was culture. And this gets where things get strange. If you look at the horoscope, most of the planets are in the west, and half of the planets are in the third quadrant. And the west is for culture, especially the third quadrant. So we can see that he was something of a culture maven. And to be more specifically, he was a maven of art, which is ruled by Venus, who is the ruler of Taurus. Now the thing is, he didn't like contemporary culture. He found it to be a little bit crass, and the only part of contemporary culture that he liked was literature, which is more ruled by Mercury than it is by Venus. But if we look at Venus, Venus forms a strong sextile with Saturn. And Saturn rules time, and it rules history. So that is where he found his values. In the written part, we see some of the contradictions of it in his consciousness, but there's too much to go into in both the oral and the written part. He loved the art and the architecture of antiquity. Saturn rules small things, and he loved those little ancient Egyptian statuettes. You know, if they go for a dig in Egypt and they come up with these things, people smuggle them out these days, and he had a collection of them, like toy soldiers, on his desk. Now, it's just a little side trip. The story of how he lost, or at least partially lost, one of them is telltale of the fact that as evolved as he was, and as much as he believed in science, and as much as he was an atheist, he did have needs of some kind or another. We'll study it later, but there is an aspect that the moon is square to Neptune, which indicates superstition. And the moon is in the 8th house, and that would be, he had superstitions about death. Now, on one occasion, I don't remember the details, it's been a number of years since I did all the biographical work for this series of talks. I believe it was when his son was in jeopardy in World War I. And what he did is he broke one of his little statuettes superstitiously. His belief in materialism, which he came through the study of science, was as much of a belief as a religion is. Because it really takes a really strong leap of faith from Darwinism to come to understand all of everything that has proceeded. It takes a big leap, and very few people can take that to be hardcore atheists. In any case, Jupiter, Pisces is on the cusp of the 5th house, the house of his children. And Pisces is probably the strongest sign associated with sacrifice. Now, ultimately, his sacrifice of his statuette was symbolic. But it wasn't really any different than somebody who was religious sacrifices a lamb or something like that in order to preserve his life. And when you encounter things like this, even out of somebody that was as atheistic as he was, you wonder if there isn't somehow within human beings a deep guilt about our attachment to matter and material things. Mysticism claims that we have, in the fall of humanity, by taking the creative force and directing it downward, we have precipitated a fall into matter that was much deeper than was intended. And if we are out of step with the divine plan, one would feel guilty. If you're playing a musical instrument and you're out of step with the rest of the orchestra or out of step with the sheet music, you feel pretty bad about that. And when things like this come out of even hardcore atheists like Sigmund Freud, you begin to wonder whether something like that is what was taking place. We need to get back on topic. The way these things come in and the way they work out is just fascinating to me. You can't help but to go out on side trips all the time. The income of Freud, which was generous, He wasn't wealthy, but he had a good income, and it was from two sources. And one was his psychiatric practice. Now, if you look at the horoscope, it's easy to see that psychiatry was part of his life. He has that sextile of Neptune to the conjunction of the Sun and Uranus, and that is excellent for psychological interest and psychological ability. Now, but that isn't where but none of those planets have anything to do with his income. You could say his income comes from the Capricorn part of the second house, because the 10th house is the house of profession, and that relates to Saturn. But that's quite a stretch. I don't know for certain how the income, the generous income from his profession, is exactly indicated in the horoscope. It's something that you have to ponder and you have to consider. Now, the other source of his income is easy to trace astrologically. It was from his writings. Opportunities for writing and publication can be found several places in the horoscope. The opportunity to write and to communicate are indicated by the third house, but to express is indicated by the fifth house. And to publish, the opportunities for that are indicated by the fifth and ninth house. Now, Freud was a very excellent writer, and he won the Goethe Prize for literature. And that's the highest prize in the German language that you can get for an accomplishment in writing. We're not going to discuss his writing skill until we get to the third house. But for now, expression and publication and receiving income from it is very clear, with the ruler of the second house being in the fifth house. So what we want to do is to understand how that worked. And so what we're going to do is look at Jupiter, and we're going to do an aspect analysis. And we're going to do an aspect analysis of Jupiter sextile Mercury. And Jupiter sextile Mercury is the strongest of the Jupiterian aspects, and it's the third or second strongest, because there's a tie between the second and the third aspects. So we're going to do an aspect analysis of that aspect. Now, every one of you should have, I passed out all of the aspect analysis for all of the aspects in the Freud chart and in the Jung chart. So you should have them. If you don't, you can go to the website and go to Spiritual Astrology and scroll down to Textbook for Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism, and you'll find all of them there. And you can print them right off of the website. Now, Mark doesn't have a printer, but Mark has foresight, and he has saved all of those things and has them readily at hand. All right, the first thing we look at is the structure of the aspect. And the structure is, we're trying to get an image in our consciousness of what's going on. Mercury is a less than average strength planet. But the aspect itself, which is the tool, is a very strong aspect. And Jupiter is the strongest planet. So this is like a relationship where a very strong planet reflects or diversifies through a planet that is weaker. Meaning to say that the Jupiter part of the aspect has way more influence and power than the Mercury part, and that's going to show up. The Mercury part can't keep up with it, so to speak. So With Jupiter, we have a very gushingly strong giver because it's in Pisces and it's in the 5th house, and that indicates a really gushy nature. And we get this when you start reading his works. He doesn't take only one idea and express it. He expresses an idea, and before that one has really been understood, he expresses another idea and another idea and another idea. And you have to read several things by him, or you have to read a piece several times over to get all of those ideas that are pointed out in his writings. All right, then we move down to the work section. The work is a composite between the two planets that are in the aspect. Mercury is concrete thought. It's definite thought. It is communication. It is clear and direct. Jupiter is abstract thought. It is generalization. It is universalization. And we see the work that is being done is blending universals with particular concrete thinking. So we can see that that's what's trying to be accomplished. And in this, the concretizing is weaker than the universalizing. Next, we move down to the quality of the aspect. And the quality of the aspect is that it's a benefic aspect, which means that this works well and it is going to be basically used for the good. So it's very clear that this is a talent that is a positive talent. It's not like a negative talent like a safecracker or somebody like that. This is something that is used for the good. And if we look at the specific aspect, it is the sextile. And the way it works is he reflects ideas, because the sextile is reflection. It's like a kaleidoscope. This is a very good kaleidoscopic aspect all together. It reflects an idea or an abstract pattern into concretion. Now, we want to look at the relative strength, and we want to take all cases, not only our own. If Mercury is stronger, that's the kind of person who gets a lot of mileage out of a few ideas. I have a Jupiter-Mercury aspect, and Mercury is much stronger than Jupiter, and I can take one small thing and I get a lot of mileage out of it, and I can, delineate quite a great deal. This is not our case. The ideal case is if there is balance. If the two planets are balanced, you can get the most out of both of them. But in this case, there is not balance. In this case, Jupiter is stronger than Mercury. If they were balanced, there would be a fluency that the ideas and the thoughts would blend right into each other, and it would be like a stream, and you wouldn't see where one left off and the other came on. So in our case, we have Jupiter stronger than Mercury. This means that he had big concepts, and he had many concepts. And when you read through his works, it is kind of disorienting at first, and you have to take time to ponder and put it all together. Now, what we're saying here is we're limited, so we're going to have to move along quicker because there's too much here. The next section is the signification. That is how it relates to the signs. In his expression, Jupiter's in a watery sign, and that's fluent. Mercury is in an earth sign, and that is concrete in the max. Jupiter is in Pisces, which is very rare, and Mercury is in Taurus, which is probably the grossest in terms of matter of all the signs. It's like bedrock or something like that. So we see we see a subtlety that not only is precipitated by Mercury, but it's precipitated into a very gross materialistic way of looking at things. It is this earthiness of the concrete expression that many people hold against him. It's almost considered vulgar, the way he states some things, because he's matter of fact about them, and people get put off by that instead of looking at the ideas. All right, next we moved on to the Dhammification section, and in the Dhammification, we can see that Mercury is succeedent, Jupiter is succeedent, and Mercury is angular. And that this indicates that the Jupiter part is sort of a sacrifice to responsibility. And the Mercury in a cardinal sign is fleet. It wants to run off. Now, Jupiter isn't a triad of houses that represent opportunities to express. And Mercury is in the house of the triad that deals with interpersonal relationships. So we can see this whole activity has something to do with expression, and expression about interrelational opportunities. And that's exactly what he wrote about. That's all of his monograms and books and things like that, with the exception of the late religious books. Now, this all seems to indicate that the expression of Mercury. So we see this as a precipitation in human affairs, and that is the source of his income. Mercury in the 7th house has to do with the talk work that he did with his patients, co-counseling, and Jupiter has more to do with his family. We look down toward the bottom. The next thing is application. And this aspect is applying, meaning it's coming on, which means that his ability to express, and while he is expressing, gains momentum. It builds and builds and builds. It isn't something that he starts out big and then fades, or starts at a level and stays at that level. This is something that builds. And if we look at the phase, we see this is a first aspect. And as a first aspect, it means it is used for construction, for building things. This constructive attitude that he has, especially talking about the unconscious, this attitude fits into European philosophy altogether. In European philosophy, it's different from American philosophy. We're talking about academic philosophy now. And most of the philosophers in America or in the New World are positivists, and they're these word choppers and logic people, whereas in Europe they follow Derrida quite a bit. And Derrida has this whole idea of finding, deconstructs a person's works and understands what's going on in the unconscious. And you can see how the life is built that way, and you can see how that is how that relates to the influence he had in European philosophy. It is a side trip that probably most people are not interested in, but I have to have something for me too. All right. In the special case, there is a special case in that these are the main two facets of the mind, the abstract mind and the concrete mind. So this is without a doubt a mental aspect. Now all of this is terribly brief. Even the aspect analysis is itself brief, and you want to do that. And then there are two other Jupiter aspects which also need to be brought in. Some of that is done in the written brief, but so the aspect analysis is brief. Everything we've done tonight is brief, and so it means, again, we're just pointing out how to do some things, and we're not doing it all. Everything that we have done tonight, all of the things, including the things that we didn't do tonight, have to be held in consciousness. And when you hold them all in consciousness, they produce something like an abstract form of consciousness. And a human being is a unity. And all of these different facets, it's not like they're like pieces of a watch or something like that. They're facets of a character that is a whole. Very rare that you have something like multiple personalities or something like that. So what you have to do is hold this all in your consciousness. Even if you go through sheet after sheet of the things that we're going through in this course, read them all and hold them in your consciousness. By the time we're at the end of these talks, a couple years from now, by the time we're at the end, we'll have a whole bunch of papers. But by holding all of that in mind, you'll be able to synthesize. You'll be able to put it all together, and you can see how one thing flows into another. Just the way we saw that his little statuettes fit into his sacrificial nature as far as finances are concerned. Now, to do the synthesizing of even what we've done tonight would take another whole talk, and I don't want to spend that much time. So we have to move on. Let's move on and do a very little bit because we're already over an hour. Let's talk a little bit about spending relative to income. Again, we can say some of the same things. Spending is as abstract as income is abstract. It is, when you say abstract, use of finances or materials or something like that, you're treating it as though they're not dollars. You know, if you ever sat in a poker game and played poker, people who are thinking and they're making a bet and they're putting a couple dollars on the table as a bet, if they're thinking of that in terms of baby needs new shoes or we gotta have eggs, if you think that way, you're always going to lose in poker because you have a small-minded kind of consciousness. But if you say these are just numbers in the sky, you can get the abstract gestalt of it all, and you evaluate relative to the game rather than to the rest of your life. And to some extent, that is a way that he treated expenditures. He would dole things out according to the need of things. By looking at Jupiter being in the 5th house, it is clear that the primary expenditure was with children. He did these things. He sacrificed for his children, which is very good because it related to his own childhood. He was a favored child. His name when he was born was called Sigismund, and he changed it to Siegfried later on. And little Sigismund, I think it was from a family of about 5, was the brightest one. And so when it came to education and spending for education, they put it all in the bright one. And so he did the same thing with his own children, only he was very, very generous with all of his children. Financially, with Sagittarius on the cusp of the 2nd and Jupiter in the 5th house being as strong as it was, he was not a selfish man. He was liberal and he was generous. And it wasn't only in ideas, It was in stuff. It stayed within the family, but that was more tradition than anything. He didn't break completely from tradition. We know only a little about the source and direction of his cash flow. And what we have done in talking about it is very incomplete. There's much more in the written brief, but not a whole lot more. But it goes into two things. To do this thoroughly, we would need to look at the other two aspects, and they are of moderate strength, not as strong as the aspect we looked at. And we don't have time to do that. So, in closing, we can say that wealth is an idea to Freud. A well-developed idea, but he didn't leave it only an idea, and he didn't have it as an end in himself. This was not somebody who would hoard or amass things. You would say that he acquired wealth in order to do the things he needed to do. Now, these are the handouts for this evening, and what is done in these briefs is different than what we did tonight. That'll always be the case. Now, the next time we meet will be 3 weeks from tonight. Next week there will be no class, no talk, because I will be in the garden. And then 2 weeks from tonight will be the Mysticism class, and then 3 weeks we'll be back here with this again. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
You talked about Jupiter being a giving planet to Mercury. But Mercury's the faster one.
Yep.
Isn't it more of a taking planet?
It depends on the relative position to each other. Mercury is forward in the zodiac, and influences always go forward in the zodiac. You can look at it as Mercury taking from Jupiter, or you can look at, yeah. But Mercury isn't strong enough to do that. Okay. It's much safer to look at Jupiter as the giving planet and Mercury as the receiver. Yes?
I was wondering what exactly determines the size of the houses?
The inclination at the place of birth to the ecliptic. If you look at this is a sort of odd-looking circle, but if I tilt it, it becomes, to your vision, it becomes more of an ellipse until they get like this, and then it's a line. And the relationship of the houses at the place of birth relative to the ecliptic, which is a circle in the heavens, if you take the houses here and break them up into 12 parts, that's what you're seeing in the horoscope. But in the angulation, 1/12 of that might take up a much larger part of the zodiac because in the angles. If you sit down with a water glass or something that has a circle like that and have another circle that is the signs, and then tilt one relative to the other, you can get an idea of what it's like. Was that a question?
No.
Okay, thank you very much.